Our last session for the day is From Tagore to Thaoor. David Davidar and Parvati Nair will be in conversation. Sarvesh Sridhar will read excerpts from 3 short stories.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a session where we're going to talk about the short story. Now, short story is this provocative little creature that nestles somewhere in between the novella and flash fiction. But maybe that's what its greatest strength is, that it sort of lurks about, defies easy definition, and continue to charm, provoke, entertain, and all the rest of it. So this evening, we're going to talk about the short story, or to be more precise, the Indian short story, or to be even more precise, 39 Indian short stories that have been collected by David Davidar into a book, into an anthology called A Clutch of Indian Masterpieces. It covers a wide spectrum from Khushwant Singh to Vaikom Muhammad Bashir, from Ruskin Bond to Kanishk Thaoor. And so I would like to sort of ask David, a project like this, how long has it been brewing? You know, when did it move from, say, a back burner to the front burner and actually take form?
Well, it actually took shape, I would say about 40 years ago, when I was a teenager, really, and first started reading Indian fiction. Because, you know, if you look around, in any given year, there are about 4 or 5 anthologies published. And at any given time, there are something like 40 or 50 anthologies of Indian fiction available. Unfortunately, pretty much all of them suffer from one major fault, which is they are practically unreadable. I mean, I said to somebody in an interview that you read them because it's like taking medicine. You know, it's good for you. It's good for your, you know, indoctrination in Indian culture, but it tastes awful, you know. So I figured and then then you have a vacuum into which rush anthologies like the one that Salman Rushdie did about 20 years ago, where he made the preposterous claim that the only good writing is taking place in English, and that all other Indian languages are, you know, have fallen by the wayside. They're antiquated. There's nothing of any note happening there, and it's our fault because. And I'm trying to be as precise here as possible. I'm talking only about books available to the reader in English. You know, I'm sure there are great anthologies in Tamil. I'm sure there are great anthologies in Telugu, great anthologies in Manipuri. And if there aren't, I know nothing about that. But in English, I think we have practically nothing that gives you enjoyment, gives you enlightenment, gives you whatever it is that a story is meant to do. So that's why I decided to put this anthology together, more out of exasperation than anything else, saying, here we are, we have this great, supposedly great cultural heritage, and it's practically invisible because, you know, you are blocked by all these poor translations, and I'm not even getting into whether the translations are accurate or not. They're simply unreadable. And then I took as my guiding light a quote that Chekhov made many years ago, where he says, I have only one criterion when it comes to literature. Good literature is literature I like, and bad literature is literature I don't like. So I say in my introduction, I didn't care whether the writer is a Brahmin or a Dalit. I didn't care if he was Telugu or Malayali. I was simply going to include stories that I thought were great from the birth of the modern short story to today.
No, that's true. And, you know, but while you were doing this, you must have wrestled with the form of the short story, which I think I sort of touched upon it. And it's not a question that you can resolve today or tomorrow, what makes a short story. Edgar Allan Poe, who sometimes, I think, inaccurately called the father of the short story, defined it as a prose tale that is limited to a certain unique or single effect and can be read in one sitting or from half an hour to 2 hours, which is all very well, but, you know, the single sitting in today's sort of fast food, quickly, you know, you want everything quick, fast, at once. So I don't even know if the question of the single sitting is still valid in today's sort of world. But if we were to sort of cast aside all these definitions, you must have wrestled with the sense of a definition when you were saying a collection of short stories. To you, what made sense? What for you worked as a short story?
Well, there have been many definitions. There's Poe, and then there's Hawthorne had a definition. Chekhov had a definition. Gogol sort of talked about the story. But the only thing that everyone seems to agree on is that the modern short story started around the second half of the 19th century. And interestingly, it started in pretty much every part of the world. So you had Americans writing it, you had Germans writing it, you had the French writing it, you had the Brits writing it, and Indians writing it as well. You know, it started in Bengal, and a lot of the short stories, the early short stories, were written as a form of protest against colonial rule. Yeah. Because you could, instead of directly opposing the colonial power, you could use metaphors, you could use fiction to make your point. And from there it just grew and grew. And you know, the thing is, short stories are anything you want to sort of, I mean, anything can practically be a short story, provided it's not a novel, you know. And this reading in one sitting is not necessarily a good enough definition, but then there is practically no good definition, okay? But what I do know is it's very difficult to write short stories simply because you can handle narrative prose or you're a novelist. And, you know, to our credit, we have dozens of great short story writers, and some of them feature in this volume.
Was length a consideration? Did you sort of set the story should be between 4,000 to 20,000 words or anything like that?
No, not at all. I said the only thing that I was going to do is I wasn't going to cheat and use excerpts from novels, as a lot of people do. These were going to be pure short stories, but then you have, say, Vikram Seth's story, which is told in verse. You have a story by Ruskin Bond, which is practically a novella. And then you have a story by Gulzar, which is a page and a half. You know, so no, length was not a consideration.
Right. Shall we ask Sridhar to read out an excerpt to see what we've been discussing so far, and maybe start with the R.K. Narayan short story, because he's always a good read and always wonderful to listen to. Thank you.
Muni sat at the foot of the statue, watching his two goats graze in the arid soil among the cactus and lantana bushes. He looked at the sun. It had tilted westwards, no doubt, but it was not the time yet to go back home. If he went too early, his wife would have no food for him. Also, he must give her time to cool off her temper and feel sympathetic. And then she would scrounge and manage to get some food. He watched the mountain road for a time signal. When the green bus appeared around the bend, he could leave, and his wife would feel pleased that he had let the goats feed long enough. He noticed now a new sort of vehicle coming down at full speed. It looked both like a motor car and a bus. He used to be intrigued by this novelty of such spectacles, but of late work was going on at the source of the river on the mountain, and an assortment of people and traffic went past him. And he took it all casually and described it to his wife later in the day. Not everything as he once did, but only some things, only if he noticed anything special. But today, while he observed the yellow vehicle coming down, he was wondering how to describe it later when it sputtered and stopped right in front of him. A red-faced foreigner who had been driving it got down and went round it, stooping, looking and poking under the vehicle. Then he straightened himself up. He looked at the dashboard, stared in Muni's direction and approached him. "Excuse me, is there a gas station nearby, or do I have to wait until another car comes?" He suddenly looked up at the clay horse and cried, "Marvelous!" without completing his sentence. Muni felt he should get up and run away, and cursed his age. He could not readily put his limbs into action. Some years ago, he could outrun a cheetah, as happened once when he went into the forest to cut fuel, and it was then that two of his sheep were mauled, a sign that bad times were coming. And though he tried, he could not easily extricate himself from his seat. And then there was also the problem of the goats. He could not leave them behind. The red-faced man wore khaki clothes, evidently a policeman or a soldier. Muni said to himself, "He will chase or shoot if I start running. Sometimes dogs chase only those who run. Oh Shiva, protect me. I don't know why this man should be after me." Meanwhile, the foreigner cried, "Marvelous!" again, nodding his head. He paced around the statue with his eyes fixed on it. Muni sat frozen for a while, and then fidgeted and tried to edge away. Now the other man suddenly passed his palms together in a salute, smiled and said, "Namaste, how do you do?" At which Muni spoke the only English expressions he had learnt. Yes, no. Having exhausted his entire English vocabulary, he then started talking in Tamil. "My name is Muni, these 2 goats are mine, and no one can gainsay it. Though our village is full of slanderers these days, who will not hesitate to say that what belongs to a man doesn't belong to him." He rolled his eyes and shuddered at the thought of evil-minded men and women peopling his village. The foreigner faithfully looked in the direction indicated by Muni's finger, gazed for a while at the 2 goats around the rocks, and with a puzzled expression took out his silver cigarette case and lit a cigarette. Suddenly, remembering the courtesies of the season, he asked, "Oh, do you smoke?" Muni answered, "Yes, no." Whereupon the red-faced man took a cigarette and gave it to Muni, who received it with surprise, having had no offer of a smoke from anyone for years now. Those days when he smoked bhang were gone with his sheep and the large-hearted busher. Nowadays, he was not able to find even matches, let alone bhang. His wife went across and borrowed fire at dawn from the neighbors even. He had always wanted to smoke a cigarette, and only once had the shopman given him one on credit, and he remembered how good it had tasted. The other flicked a lighter open and offered a light to Muni. Muni felt so confused about how to act that he blew on it and put it out. The other, puzzled but undaunted, flourished his lighter and presented it again, and lit Muni's cigarette. Muni drew a deep puff and started coughing. It was racking, no doubt, but extremely pleasant. When his cough subsided, he wiped his eyes and took stock of the situation, understanding that the other man was not an inquisitor of any kind. Yet, in order to make sure, he remained wary. No need to run away from a man who gave him such a potent smoke. His head was reeling from the effect of one of those strong American cigarettes made with roasted tobacco. The man said, "I come from New York." He took out a wallet from his hip pocket and presented his card. Muni shrank away from the card. Perhaps he was trying to present a warrant and arrest him. Beware of khaki, one part of his mind warned him. Take all the cigarettes or bhang or whatever he offers, but don't get caught. Beware of khaki. He wished he wasn't 70, as the shopman had said. At 70, one didn't run, but surrendered to whatever came. He could only ward off trouble by talk. So he went on, in the chaste Tamil for which Kritam was famous. Out of this heritage, the Tamil language gushed through Muni in an unimpeded flow. He said, "Before God, sir, Bhagwan, who sees everything, I tell you, sir, that we know nothing of the case. If the murder was committed, whoever did it will not escape. Bhagwan is all seeing, sir. Don't ask me about it. I know nothing." A body had been found mutilated and thrown under a tamarind tree at the border between Kritam and Kubam a few weeks before, giving rise to much gossip and speculation. Now, Muni added an explanation. "Anything is possible there. People over there will stop at nothing." The foreigner nodded his head and listened courteously, though he understood nothing. "Now, I'm sure you know where this horse was made," said the red man, and smiled ingratiatingly. Muni reacted to the relaxed atmosphere by smiling himself and pleaded, "Please go away, sir. I know nothing. I promise we will hold him for you if we see any bad character around, and we will bury him up to his neck in a coconut pit if he tries to escape. But our village has always had a clean record. It must definitely be from the other village." Now the red man implored, "Please, please, I will speak slowly, so please try to understand me. Can't you understand even a simple word of English? Everyone in this country seems to know English. I have got along with English everywhere in this country, but you don't speak it. Now, have you any religious or spiritual scruples for avoiding the English speech?" Now, Muni made some indistinct sounds in his throat and shook his head. Encouraged, the other went on to explain at length, uttering each syllable with care and deliberation. Presently, he slided over and took a seat beside the old man, explaining, "You see, last August, we probably had the hottest summer in history. and I was working in shirt sleeves in my office on the 40th floor of the Empire State Building. You must have heard of the power failure, and there I was, stuck for 4 hours, no elevator, no air conditioning. All the way in the train, I kept thinking. And the minute I reached home in Connecticut, I told my wife, Ruth, we're going to visit India in the winter. It's time to go look at other civilizations. Now, the next day, she called the travel agent and first thing and told him to fix it. And so here I am. Ruth came with me, but is staying back at Srinagar, and I'm the one doing the rounds and joining her later. Muni looked reflective at the end of this long peroration and said rather feebly, yes, no, as a concession to the other's language, and went on in Tamil. When I was this high, he indicated a foot high, I heard my uncle say. Now, no one can tell what he was planning to say, as the other interrupted him at this stage to ask, boy, what is the secret of your teeth? Now, how old are you? The old man forgot what he had started to say and remarked, sometimes we lose our cattle. Jackals or cheetahs may carry them off, but sometimes it is just theft from over in the next village. And then we will know who has done it. Our priest at the temple can see in the camphor flame the face of the thief, and when he is caught, he gestured with his hands a perfect mincing of meat. The American watched his hands intently and said, I know what you mean. Chop something? Now maybe I'm holding you up and you want to chop wood. So where's your axe? Now hand it to me and show me what to chop. I do enjoy it, you know, just a hobby. We get a lot of driftwood along the backwater near my house, and on Sundays I do nothing but chop wood for the fireplace. I really feel different when I watch the fire in the fireplace. And although it may take all the sections of the Sunday New York Times to get a fire started. And he smiled at this reference. Muni felt totally confused, but decided the best thing to do would be to make an attempt to get away from this place. He tried to edge out saying, must go home, and turned to go. The other seized his shoulder and said desperately, now, is there no one, absolutely no one here to translate for me? He looked up and down the road, which was deserted in this hot afternoon. A sudden gust of wind churned up the dust and dead leaves on the roadside into a ghostly column and propelled it towards the mountain road. The stranger almost pinioned Muni's back to the statue and asked, isn't this statue yours? Why don't you sell it to me? The old man now understood the reference to the horse. He thought for a second and said in his own language, I was an urchin this high when I heard my grandfather explain this horse and warrior. And my grandfather himself was this high when he heard his grandfather, whose grandfather, the other man interrupted him with, I don't want to seem to have stopped here for nothing. So I'll offer you a good price for it, he said, indicating the horse. He had concluded without the least doubt that Muni owned the mud horse. Perhaps he guessed by the way he sat at his pedestal, like other souvenir sellers in this country presiding over their wares. Muni followed the man's eyes and pointing fingers and dimly understood the subject matter, and, feeling relieved that the theme of the mutilated body had been abandoned, at least for the time being, said again enthusiastically, I was this high when my grandfather told me about this horse and the warrior, and my grandfather was this high when he himself, and he was getting into a deeper bog of reminiscence each time he tried to indicate the antiquity of the statue. The Tamil that Muni spoke was stimulating, even as a pure sound, and the foreigner listened with fascination. Oh, I wish I had my tape recorder here, he said, assuming the pleasantest expression. Your language sounds wonderful. I get a kick out of every word you utter right here. And he indicated his ears. But you don't have to waste your breath in sales talk. I appreciate this article. You don't have to explain its points. I never went to a school. In those days, only Brahmins went to schools. But we had to go out and work in the fields morning till night, from sowing to harvest time. And when Pongal came, we had cut the harvest. My father allowed me to go out and play with the others at the tank. And so I don't know the Parangi language you speak. Even the little fellows in your country probably speak this Parangi language. But here, only the learned men and officers know it. We had a postman in our village who could speak to you boldly in your language. But his wife ran away with someone else, and he does not speak to anyone nowadays. Who would if a wife did what she did? Women must be watched, otherwise they will sell themselves and your house. And he laughed at his own quip. The foreigner laughed heartily, took out another cigarette and offered it to Muni, who now smoked with ease, deciding to stay on if the fellow was going to be so good as to keep up his cigarette supply. The American now stood up on the pedestal in the attitude of a demonstrative lecturer and said, running his finger along some of the carved decorations around the horse's neck, speaking slowly and uttering his words syllable by syllable. I could give you a sales talk for this better than anyone else. This is a marvelous combination of yellow and indigo, though faded now. How do you people of this country achieve these flaming colors? Muni, now assured that the subject was still the horse and not the dead body, said, this is our guardian. It means death to our adversaries. At the end of Kali Yuga, the world and all the other worlds will be destroyed, and the Redeemer will come in the shape of a horse called Kalki. This horse will come to life and gallop and trample down all the bad men. As he spoke of bad men, the figures of his shopman and his brother-in-law assumed concrete forms in his mind, and he revelled for a moment in the predicament of the fellow under the horse's hoof. Served him right for trying to set fire to his house. Now, while he was brooding on this pleasant vision, the foreigner utilized the pause to say, I assure you that this will have the best home in USA. I'll push away the bookcase, or you know I love books, and I'm a member of 5 book clubs. And the choice and bonus volumes really mount up to a pile in our living room as high as this horse itself. But they'll have to go. The Ruth may disapprove, but I'll convince her. The TV may have to be shifted too. We can't have everything in the living room. Ruth will probably say, what about when we have a party? I'm going to keep him right in the middle of the room. I don't see how that can interfere with the party. We'll stand around him and have our drinks.
Thank you. And yes, I think R.K. Narayan, he sort of stands up. You know, he's always wonderful to hear and certainly stands the test of time. Though, when you picked him, did you have this problem of which story shall I pick?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Narayan, there were 2 stories that were favorites. One was A Horse and Two Goats, and the other was An Astrologer's Day. So I had that problem with a few people, Kushwant Singh, R.K. Narayan, Vikram Seth from his Beastly Tales. But, you know, of the 39 stories in this book, I think most of them just chose themselves.
You know, when you sort of said, when you were doing your picking, you said there were stories that you loved, not liked, loved, which, yeah, you could say is a subjective point of view. But then you also said you wanted stories which had a certain Indian sensibility. Now, is that something that we can define? Do you think this collection of Indian stories together defines that quality of being Indian, or is it a movable feast? When you said Indian sensibility, what did you mean? What were you thinking of?
You know, I'm coming here from a session in Calcutta which was similar, and at that session there's Shashi Thaoor, Rupamani Chatterjee and a whole bunch of others who also feature in this book. And we talked about that for a bit. And I must also say that, you know, I remember talking to Vikram about it many years ago, and you know, the thing is, you can write about Alaska as an Indian writer, but there are certain civilizational things which we as Indians bring to our fiction or any form of creativity. Nayantara Sehgal talked about it at some other, not this festival, but some other festival, where she said, I don't think that people who have not lived in this country and have been acted upon by this country can actually call themselves Indian writers or can write authentic Indian work. I wouldn't be that extreme. I'd say, you know, if you're steeped in India, where you don't feel the need to interpret this country to suit the tastes of, say, an editor in New York or in London, which is one of the most common reasons why people actually start writing a weird kind of hybrid fiction. I think that is the Indian sensibility. I mean, it's hard to define. It's hard to say that you can sort of paint that by numbers, saying if you tick off all these boxes, you have an Indian sensibility. But I think you can recognize it when you see it, you know, and it's not based on location, it's not based on the color of your passport, but it's based on something that's ineffably Indian. And all these stories have it.
And well, I mean, the other obvious thing which makes this collection of stories Indian is the work in translation. You know, it's, I think, a unique selling point that India's richness and diversity comes from, what, the 30-odd languages we write in and which are translated. And I think it's amazing that that voice is heard in this, in this book. But again, there you have recommissioned translations. Now, is that because the originals were bad, or because you think that, you know, as we change generationally, the language changes and the words change and the interests change? Why the retranslations?
Well, a bit of both. I think we're very poorly served by our translations. I think that's number one. I think, you know, a very simple criterion for this book, besides the fact that these are stories that I think needed to be in an anthology together, was the fact that it had to work for the reader in English. You know, so I didn't actually look at stories that were necessarily, you know, a lot of anthologies suffer from the quota system. We need to have this many from the south, this many from the north, this many from the east, this many from the west, all the Jnanpith Award winners, all the Nobel Prize winners, well, one of them, etc., etc. I said, I took as my basic criterion the fact that they had to work in English. You know, the reason you can read Garcia Marquez brilliantly in English is not just because of the brilliance of Gregory Rabassa and Helen Lane. It's because he lends himself to translation, and that's what Rabassa says in an interview. Ramanujam has been criticized by many people for dumbing down certain aspects of, say, somebody like Anantamurthy. And he says, look, I work with translators, so what you require is a happy medium, and that is what we're trying to do here. They have to work for readers in English, you know. And so stories were left out because they simply were too rooted in their milieu to actually move. The other thing, as you say, is some of the great stories that we translated from generation to generation. And so we worked very hard on the translations. We commissioned some of the best translators and writers in the business to translate the stories. So they do work, I think, in English.
I know, I noticed you've got writers to translate as well. How did that come about? Were they open to the idea? Was it sort of difficult to convince them? And do you feel they bring something special to the work being translated into a language in which they are so comfortable writing in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, the danger is if one writer is translating another writer, sometimes the writer who's translating tries to impose his vision on the work. But I think if you get to a happy medium where the writer in the target language, which is English in this case, and the writer in the original language actually are able to sit across a table or, you know, in front of their respective monitors and say, look, we'll choose this word over that word, then you will get to something that actually works. And then we edited as well. We didn't accept the translations at face value. We said, again, I said, this is a book that should read as though it's been written by native speakers, whether it's a story from Telugu, a story from, you know, Malayalam, or whatever.
No, I think it works. The other thing I wanted to ask was, you know, there is sometimes the sense that a short story is a precursor to a longer story, that it's the sketch that will eventually become the painting. And, you know, in that light, one of the stories that we were planning to read, but maybe we will not have the time, is Kama by Vikram Chandra, where you sort of see his famous protagonist make its first appearance. So do you think that we're sort of getting, and in that case it's a happy event that, you know, this story from Love and Longing then goes on to have its own full-fledged life in Sacred Games. But do you feel that? Do you feel that in any way there's some kind of hierarchical feeling between the short story and the novel? Or have we gotten over that?
Not at all, and I think it's a perennial thing. I think writing a short story is very different from writing a novel. And not all novelists can write short stories, and it's a rare short story writer who then, a pure short story writer who then goes on to write novels. In our country, the person who's best is known for his short stories is Ruskin Bond, who's written maybe one or two novella-ish kind of books, but not full-length novels. Because I think they're completely different disciplines. You know, it's like the difference between a runner, a marathon, and a sprinter. You know what I mean? You don't automatically run the longer distance because you're good at the shorter thing and vice versa. The one thing I know, and this is inexplicable, is that short story collections don't sell as well as novels for some reason, you know? And then there are all kinds of theories, but none of them actually fit, you know? Because they say with shorter attention spans today, people are presumably going to be reading shorter forms of things. It doesn't work. You can still have Eleanor Catton's book, which is almost 800 pages long, sell well, or A Suitable Boy. So I think what it comes down to is what you're good at. And the people in this book are exceptionally good at short story writing.
Well, Good Earth itself went on to win, I forget, the Commonwealth Prize. And, you know, collections of short stories like Alice Munro won the Nobel, Jhumpa Lahiri's won the Pulitzer. There are writers who are now debuting with short story collections. Do you feel, even though I think we've discussed this once, that it is hard to market and to sell as a publisher the short story, is there some kind of resurgence going on? Is it now easier to write, put together, sell, package the short story?
No, I don't think so. But I think what has happened is with the rise of online publishing, you write a short story, you can put it up on some site, you know, so you will be read. You don't have to wait for a traditional publisher to come along and sort of, you know, say, I'm going to publish a short story writer. Having said that, the most exciting writer, I believe, I have noticed in the last decade is the only person in this book who's never published a story before, and that's Kanishk. We're publishing his first book at the end of the year, and he's quite extraordinary. And all he's done is write short stories which bear traces of Borges and Calvino and, you know, Vargas Llosa and all of the great Latin Americans. And, you know, I mean, I think the stories are so stunning that they will seduce the reader with their brilliance, you know, and maybe he'll go on to write a novel, but at the moment he's just working on short stories.
Yeah, well, he also seems like a great inheritor of the tradition set by R.K. in some sense. You know, there is a likeness to the pen and maybe a hard head that goes with it, which is, yeah, very beguiling. Do you feel that, as you were putting this together, that there were, in this sense, themes or styles or things that came up again, whether it was, you know, the partition or violence or erotica or political longing? Did you feel that when you were putting it together, that there were certain themes that sort of asserted itself in an Indian way within a certain Indian sensibility?
No, it was completely eye-opening. I mean, I've been reading, like I say in my introduction, I've been reading short story, well, Indian fiction for about 40 years. But actually working on this gave me a completely new sort of appreciation of the enormous range and exceptional brilliance of a lot of these writers. And, you know, I'm glad I did it at this point in my career rather than 20 years ago when I was first asked to do a collection like this by a publisher in London. And I said no at that point because I said, look, I simply haven't read enough. You know, after 40 years of reading, you realize that this country is unique among all the nations on the planet because no other nation can actually claim to have 30 plus literatures extending back 1,000 years or several hundred years at the very least. And then so in each of these literatures, there are writers refining their craft, innovating, pushing the boundaries, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite extraordinary. You know, you have ghost stories, you have slice of life stories, you have horror stories, you have mystery stories, you have dramas, you have humor. It's quite a feast.
A movable feast?
Yes, a movable feast.
I think if we want another reading, we would have to
Yeah,
ask.
okay. Maybe the Gulzar story then?
Yes.
The Gulzar story? The Gulzar story?
Mr. Patel was a very helping kind of man, Kaimal said. Kaimal was in his 60s, a retired merchant navy captain who lived 2 floors below the Patels in a flat of the same size and floor plan. We bought together, Kaimal said, 7 years ago, almost exactly. Before that, we rented in the same building in Santa Cruz. Mrs. Kaimal brought out coffee in small steel tumblers, and Kaimal rubbed his forehead absently and ran a finger around the edge of the glass. A moment passed and Mrs. Kaimal sat down beside her husband and put a hand on his wrist. Behind them, Katekar, who was a tea drinker, sniffed suspiciously at his glass. He was very much younger than I am, Kaimal said quietly. Was he well liked in the building here? Sartaj said. Kaimal looked up and nodded. Yes, he was the president of the building society for 3 years in a row. He organized all our functions. Leaning forward, Kaimal said decisively, he got jobs for children of many people here. He sat back and said again, he was younger than I am. You must have seen Kshitij grow up, Sartaj said. Oh yes, he's a very intelligent boy. Did his father think so? Sartaj said. Kaimal looked at him consideringly, and Sartaj could see the beginnings of distaste. This was familiar. The policeman's assumption of grief and deceit hidden in every happiness was frightening in its simplicity. It implicated everyone. Of course, he was very proud of him, very proud. And his mother is proud too, Sartaj said. What else, of course? Kshitij is a very good son to her. It is good to see a young man with such respect for his mother these days. And were they happy together? Who? Kaimal said. Mr. and Mrs. Patel, Sartaj said. Were they happy? Happy, Mrs. Kaimal said, shaking her head exasperated. They were husband and wife. What else could they be? Sartaj finished his coffee. It was very good coffee indeed. In people like this, decent and hospitable, loyalty to the departed was always the most unbreakable bond. They were telling a truth that had become sharp and clear in the sudden glare of death, and he knew he couldn't persuade them to turn them back towards the shadowed ambiguities that were so crucial to him. That would cause them to break with their obligations. I see, he said slowly. I see. He looked at Mrs. Kaimal until she shifted uncomfortably, and then both husband and wife seemed to shrink against the faded lily pattern of their sofa. And then Sartaj said quietly, were you aware if Mr. Patel was in any kind of trouble? Did he seem afraid? Had he told you of any threats or quarrels? Threats? Kaimal said. No. As Sartaj stood up, they watched him apprehensively, turned their heads to watch Katekar's thumping walk. He thanked them for the coffee, told them to contact him if they remembered anything, and then he shut the door quietly behind himself and Katekar. They were a nice old pair, handsome and fine-drawn and cultured, but he had no regret for inflicting fear on them. It was what his job required of him. This distance from the rest of the world, their wariness of him, it was inevitable and necessary. And he knew that very often it was this very thing that made it possible for him to grasp the truth, to see the secret and fix it forever. Usually, he thought nothing of it. He never needed to. But today, the click of the lock brought with it a bitter little bubble of loneliness in his mouth. He looked up and down the stairs, leaned towards the grille door that covered the lift shaft, and spat into the long pit. And then they went on to the next flat. As the day went on, as they walked down the stairs from one home to another, Sartaj watched the sweat stain grow between Katekar's shoulder blades and spread across the large breadth of his back. By late afternoon, from the fragments of many conversations, from hesitations and illusions and things left unsaid, he had teased out these unremarkable facts. The father was a genial man, full of humor, ready to backslap and also to come to one's help when needed. The son was known for his intelligence, for his first rank in every exam, for his quietness. The mother was a good cook, and she doted on her son and laughed at her husband's jokes. The husband and wife went for drives every Saturday, long drives.
Thank you. The import of some of that will only become clear if you actually read the story. But I know we're sort of running out of time, but I did want to sort of say this. When you're putting together a collection and you're calling it masterpieces, when it's sort of Tagore and Arkinarayan, it's easy. You know, they have themselves stood the test of time. But anything else later, did you feel that you were sort of, it's a gamble, that you're sort of staking your money on these names? 40 years later, when you continue to be an attentive reader, Do you think these people would last the test of time and be there?
Well, one of the reviews said that. They said, "Are you done?" I mean, and I said, pretty much. I've done nothing but read Indian fiction for a long, long time. And I would say all of this is subjective, but I think these stories are probably going to last. I think they are masterpieces. And it's very difficult to actually write a masterpiece and then have it seen as such, And obviously, like you said, the ones in the 19th century and the early 20th century have stood the test of time. Is Kanishk Thaoor going to last? Is there, there's an erotic story which is written by a woman who wrote it under a pseudonym for fear of a backlash. But I think it's quite spectacular, and yes, I do believe these stories will last.
Inshallah. Well, before we sort of call it a wrap, as we will be told, are there questions? Yes. So while he asks this question, were there anything left out of this anthology, or which might come into a second book?
Well, I don't know, but I don't know. I don't know. I think I put in everything that I wanted to. There's only one story that I tried to get, which I couldn't get, because the estate didn't give us permission by one of our late greats, and I'm not going to tell you what that story is. But otherwise, every single story I wanted, the rights holders were happy to give us permission.
Sir, can there be a short story without a story? And the relation between the content and the story. I would like you to enlighten me on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I understand what you're asking. Look, there isn't one particular short story technique. I mean, with the advent of Chekhov, that barrier was sort of dissolved. I mean, before that, you had to have very tightly plotted narratives, and that was the convention. But then Chekhov came and did what I suppose is called a slice of life story. He evoked a mood, a character, whatever. So there are some stories that are tightly plotted, and there are stories which are slightly more avant-garde in that way.
Hello, sir. Good evening. You said a writer cannot balance both novels and stories, but with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy it happened. They wrote both stories and novels and they were successful. But Chekhov wrote stories and he balanced with the plays, his plays. So you can balance two mediums in the literature. They're all successful.
Oh, I mean, for every statement that I say is the truth, there's an equal and opposite statement which is also true. So there are writers who do stories in novels. Narayan is a good example. If I understand your question correctly. Dostoevsky obviously did stories and novels. But there are some people like Raymond Carver, for example, V.S. Pritchett, who did only stories. I mean, they're known for their stories, let's put it that way. So it depends on what your facility is for stories or for novels.
Hello. Yeah, my question is actually if there is a new writer, okay, and that writer just has a sketch, a small sketch, a character sketch, say, and she or he wants to develop on that, okay. But now if we are going to develop the character, characters, like a character sketch, would you say that would be more suited for a short story or for a novel? Like, would a novel involve a character sketch plus a story? Whereas in a short story, is it possible to have both a sketch, a character sketch and a story line? Or, because it's very difficult in a short story to do both. Like, shouldn't a short story be just the story?
No, I don't think there is any one rule that says a short story cannot have a story as well as strong characters, and that only a novel can do that. A story can do that as well. And there are many stories in this book which do that successfully.
I just have one question for you. In US, we have the Best American Short Stories, which is an anthology that comes out every year.
By Norton, yeah.
The O. Henry Prize winning, or the shortlisted stories which come out every year. Is there scope for such an endeavor in India, both written in the English language as well as, translations of regional languages which could be available to English language readers?
Yes, there's plenty of scope. I mean, the Sahitya Academy does a lot of these things. Katha does these things. But, my problem is, most of these are done very badly. Katha does a good job, But Sahityek Academy, which is our government sort of organization charged with doing these things, the books are shoddy, the translations are bad. So yes, they try and do them, but we need to do them well.
Anything in the near future we can look forward to?
Well, if that's all, I think I will have to say thank you to David for, well, putting together this wonderful book and for taking the time to be with us this evening. Thank you, Sarvesh, for the readings, and of course to all of you for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you.